Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Richard, and I'm a technical pre-sales engineer here at PowerSyncPro. Today, we're going to go over our new Azure Marketplace image for deploying a PowerSyncPro server. And that's going to let you quickly deploy a PowerSyncPro server with minimal effort via the Azure Marketplace. So we're going to do a few things today. We're going to deploy a new PowerSyncPro server into Microsoft Azure using the Marketplace image. We're going to do some server configuration basics, getting a certificate using Let's Encrypt. We're going to deploy the directory sync agent out to an on-prem server so that we can pull data from an on-prem Active Directory into the cloud-based PowerSyncPro server. And we're going to show how to register a migration agent on a workstation. So here's kind of an idea of how we're going to set this up today. We've got our PowerSyncPro server, which we're going to spin up in Azure. We're going to use the default Azure domain name, and we're going to get a certificate for it using Let's Encrypt. Version 3.3 of the Marketplace image has the ability to use Let's Encrypt, so we can easily get a certificate for our default Azure domain. In this case, we're going to do mktpl marketplace-demo.eastus.cloudapp.azure.com, but this can change. You can customize this. And that server is going to connect to a remote sync agent. Now, this exists on a server in my on-prem environment, and that server is joined to my jrr.me domain. My jrr.me domain controllers, which contain all of our directory information that we need to pull into PowerSyncPro, does not have internet access. So what the sync agent lets us do is act as a middleman between the server sitting in Azure, and this server is not going to have any ties back to the on-prem environment. It's going to be completely isolated in a DMZ. And we're going to use the remote sync agent to connect to the on-prem domain controller and then shuttle that traffic across the public internet via an encrypted tunnel to the server hosted in Azure. And then at the end, we're going to have Migration Agent installed on a laptop or a workstation. Actually, it's this workstation that's running the presentation, which is joined to jrr.me as well. And that laptop can be anywhere. It could be at a user's home. It could be out in the field. It could be on the corporate network. It doesn't matter. So some things we're not going to do in this demo that would be needed for a end-to-end migration is we're not going to create a target directory. So we're not going to create a target entry or a target AD that these machines are going to move into. We're not going to build sync profiles for matching users between the source and the target directory, which is critical for doing a workstation migration to build that translation table between the user and the source and the user and the target. And we're not going to do any of the server hardening, licensing, mapping, runbooks, any of the other tasks that are required to do an end-to-end migration. We're just going to kind of do a couple of the architectural foundations of the migration so you can see how to do that with a marketplace image. So our steps today are we're going to deploy that Azure VM, we're going to configure the remote sync agent, and then we're going to configure the migration agent to talk back to the server. So let's get started. First, I want to start by saying we've got a great KB at kb.powersyncpro.com. It's got articles about many different things related to the PowerSyncPro experience. I highly recommend you check it out. And we also have our documentation, which exists at powersyncpro.com/documentation. There's several PDFs here with all the information you could ever need to configure and deploy PowerSyncPro. So if you have questions, check the documentation on the KB first, and then feel free to reach out to support. So here's the KB page about the Azure Marketplace image and how to deploy it, information about what ports you're going to need to have open, how to get a certificate, completing the setup after the installation, and we're going to walk through these today. So we'll start over at the Microsoft Azure Marketplace, where we've pulled up the PowerSyncPro directory sync and migration agent marketplace image, and we're going to be sure to deploy PowerSyncPro version 3.3, should be here in the plan. And we're going to create that. And now we have some things we need to set up within Azure. So we need to give this machine a name. And then we need to set an availability zone. In this case, we don't need any redundancy on this server. And we have to choose the size of our VM. I highly recommend you check out the KB in the documentation about choosing a VM. But for a small migration, you'll probably be fine on something like a D2DS with 2 vCPUs and 8 gigs of RAM with the default 128 gigs of storage. If you're getting bigger, thousands of machines, thousands of users, then you probably do want to consider getting something a little bigger. The nice thing about the marketplace image is we use a fully licensed version of SQL. We're not using SQL Express, so we don't have any of the limitations that would limit PowerSyncPro when running on SQL Express, like the 10 or 50 gig limits present in SQL Express. I'm going to set up a default username and password, and then we'll just go through. Disks, you can typically leave as default with the default 128 gig disk that's included. And then it's just important to note that we do have some network security group or firewall rules that are pre-configured. In this situation, I'm just putting this machine in a brand new DMZ completely isolated from anything else I have going on in Azure, but you could integrate it into another environment that you've already got present in Azure. That's not a problem. So we'll just come through here and we'll make a couple of customizations and we'll review and create the image. And we're good. So we're going to create this image and Azure is going to go out and build the deployment. And now we wait a couple of seconds while Azure provisions this virtual machine. All right, so our deployment has succeeded and we can jump over to the virtual machine resource. So first thing we want to look at is our public IP. So this is the public IP provided by Azure for this virtual machine. We have a couple of options for DNS on this machine. We can either use the default DNS name label that's included with Azure, or you could add this IP to your public DNS for one of the domains you own in something like Cloudflare, Amazon Route 53, just any DNS provider that you use for your domain. If you're planning on using PowerSyncPro with a certificate provided by your organization or by another trusted certificate authority, then I would set the DNS custom in your DNS provider. But if you're going to use Let's Encrypt, we can just use the default provided by Azure here. So I'm going to set my DNS name to MKTPL demo, and we're going to click apply. And we also need to look into the network security groups that are present on the system. So under network settings, we can see under here, by default, we add a couple. We add 80 and 443. 80 is used for Let's Encrypt to get a certificate. 443 is used so the migration agent can access this server running on user endpoints from wherever those machines are. And then we allow RDP by default. If you're going to leave this server up for an extended period of time, I highly recommend either disabling RDP and accessing the machine via another method, a VPN, an RMM, some other remote screen sharing, or at least IP limiting your RDP access to specific IP addresses. We also need to open another port. This remote sync agent talks to the PSP server on port 5001. So we need to open up 5001, and we should limit that to the source IP of the machine that's running the agent. So if we come over here and we look at our sync agent server, this is our Windows server that will be running sync agent. We just need to look up its public IP address, and then we should whitelist this within Azure. So for source, we're going to do a specific IP address, and we're going to put that IP address in, and then we're going to whitelist port 5001 to talk to the server. And we're going to call this PSP 5001. So now we've got 80, 443, and 5001 open along with RDP. We need to log into this via RDP. Yep. So we need to log in using the account we created earlier when we set it up in Azure. And since it's a new first login, we just need to accept the RDP certificate. So now we're going to log into the server here, and on first login, we're going to run some scripts that help complete the PowerSyncPro setup. So when you first log in, you'll see this command prompt pop up that just says completion, configuration completion, do not close. Don't close the window. And then once we get to the desktop, this window should progress and start completing the setup. Okay, so now we're beginning setup. Right now, we're just making sure that the SQL database is ready. And then we're going to start up the PowerSyncPro service. All right, so PowerSyncPro is running. Now we're going to jump into certificate configuration. So here we have a couple of options. One is let's get a certificate using Let's Encrypt. It's a completely free, valid, fully trusted SSL certificate provided by the Let's Encrypt Foundation. You can bring your own certificate. So if you set up DNS in your public DNS for this, say, psp.company.com, and you have a wildcard cert or a cert for psp.company.com provided by a trusted registrar that your organization uses, you can copy it to the system and import it using bring your own certificate. And then there's the option to use a self-signed cert, which we don't recommend. In this situation, since we've got all the groundwork built, we're just going to use a Let's Encrypt cert, and we have to give it the domain that we want to use. And in this case, it's that default Azure domain. And then we have to give it an email address to use for renewals. So this is where Let's Encrypt will notify you if this cert doesn't get renewed. So we go out and we resolve that. We double check that we can get from, or that Let's Encrypt will be able to access the system to get the certificate. And we do that, and everything looks good here. So let's start the process. So we go through and we do some cleanup, we do some housekeeping, we do some hardening on SSL protocols allowed to the system. We configure the firewall on the local system, and then we go out to Let's Encrypt using PowerShell and grab the trusted certificate for the system. So right now we're getting set up to go out to Let's Encrypt, and we're getting the certificate from Let's Encrypt. So there we go. We've obtained the certificate. And now we're setting up a scheduled test to renew this. We'll do this. We'll check every week if the certificate needs to be renewed and renew it if necessary. We're ready for reboot. So we made a bunch of changes here, and it's best if you reboot the server immediately after the setup completes. So we're just going to hit enter, and we're going to reboot. So now we're at the state where we brought up the server in Marketplace. We've updated our DNS just using the internal address, and we've made sure that our network security groups are correct, and we've installed that public SSL cert using Let's Encrypt. Now we need to get into configuring our sync agent, which will involve getting connected up to the server, doing a couple of configurations there, and then configuring our sync server running within the on-prem environment. All right, so just a couple of things to note here on the server. The install script drops a little note that explains some of the configuration changes made to the server, includes the default password. So if you forget it or you don't know it, just check this README on the desktop. And then we also add an icon on the desktop for PowerSyncPro. So you can just double click that and it'll bring you right into Edge and get you to the login page for PowerSyncPro. We'll just log in with our default credentials here, which are in that notepad on the desktop. And we need to do some configuration. So if we look in the remote agents tab here, we don't have any remote agents. It's a completely fresh install. That would make sense. But we need a couple of things to do that. So we're going to need a pre-shared key. And this is a one-time use pre-shared key that is put into the server running the agent that allows it to authenticate against the server. So in this case, our on-prem domain is jrr.me, and the machine running the agent is going to be jrr-sync agent. So we'll save that, we'll copy this key to the clipboard, and we'll save it out. We also need to make sure that we have a certificate for remote agents. So you come to certificates here on the sidebar, click create, and just generate a certificate. So we click save there. So now we're at the point where we should be able to install our sync agent on this server. This server is in JRR domain. There's me logged in, and it can talk to the domain controllers. So it's got connectivity into the internal environment. I've already downloaded our PSP directory sync agent installer here on the desktop. So we'll just start the installation process, and we need that pre-shared key we created earlier, and we need the domain for the server. mktpl-demo.eastus.cloudapp.azure.com. And we need to talk on port 5001 because on 5001 we can use gRPC, which is required for the remote sync agent setup. The traditional migration agent that's installed on user workstations only needs 443. It does not need 5001. And actually, one-click tip, if we take this address and we go to our browser and we try to open the page, we should get the PowerSyncPro migration agent endpoint information. That tells you that you are able to talk to the server on 5001. We're just going to run the agent as local system, and we're going to start the installation. We'll require admin rights to do that. So the agent is now installed, and it's asking if we want to run configuration tool. Before we fire up the configuration tool, let's jump back over to our PowerSyncPro server, and we're going to review here and see if an agent has registered. So we come over to remote agents here, and we can see that JRR sync agent has presented itself to the server, and it's waiting for approval. This sync agent is going to have access to pull in sensitive data, which is mainly your Active Directory data. So we want to make sure that it's explicitly allowed to connect before we do it. So I'm just going to click here and say approve. And now the agent is registered, approved, and ready to go. So the next step would be on the sync agent server. We're going to run the configuration tool, and we're going to set up a connection back to our domain. So our domain controller in the JRR domain is jrr-dc1.jrr.me. If you use SSL or LDAP-S to talk to your domain controllers, you can configure that here. But I'm going to provide a PSP service account that can talk to the domain controller here. So we entered those credentials, we hit test connection, and we're connected. So the agent is happy and it can talk to the domain controller. We'll just save out these changes, and those will be reflected up in the PowerSyncPro server. So now at this point, the migration agent is running. It runs as a Windows service. It checks, it pulls in information from the AD, which is hosted locally, whenever the server requests. So let's go over to the server and see how we would add this Active Directory. So in directories here, fresh install, we don't have any directories currently added, but we need to add the jr.me domain that we just added to that sync agent. So we're going to create a new directory, and we're going to do Active Directory. We're going to give it a display name. This is completely up to you. And then we're going to choose the sync agent. Important to note here, if you do sync agent none, the server asks for credentials. So this is for a line of sight connection to a domain controller. So if this server was installed on a network where it could talk to the domain controllers natively, cool, great. Just provide those credentials here, and we'll phone out to the domain controller directly and pull in the information we need. Since we're using a sync agent, you'll notice it doesn't ask for any credentials. That's because the credentials that we provided here in the configuration tool are kept within this server. They never leave and they never go to the PowerSyncPro server. So that means that if you're in a sensitive environment where the client doesn't want to provide you or have the credentials to access their domain controllers leave their network, they stay on the network within the agent, and then they never leave. They don't end up on the server, which is pretty sweet. So we're going to choose our domain, which would be jr.me, and we're going to try to import everything out of that AD. So we'll hit save here, and we're going to get a job that runs. That's going to go out to the agent's now going to go out to the server, and it's going to try to refresh the schema and import the containers and OUs from that domain. So we've pulled the schema in, and we've successfully imported containers. So now this directory is added. It's talking through this domain controller, which is isolated from the internet, is talking through the remote sync agent, which is hosted on-prem, to the PowerSyncPro server. Just to prove that, let's just try to run an import. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to run an import objects job, and I'm going to do a full import from my AD. And if we just take a look here and we refresh this, you can see that within a couple of seconds, we've pulled in 73 objects. And we can check our single object report, which will allow us to see what's in the database about this domain. We can see all of our users. If we expand this out to 100, we can see all of our computers. So everything that's in this domain has been replicated up to PowerSyncPro. So looking at our presentation again, we've got our server, we've got a remote sync agent and connection to our domain controller. Now we need to deal with our migration agent. The migration agent configuration. So we're going to have to do two things. We're going to have to add the PSK for the migration agent, create the certificate, and then we're going to install and register the migration agent on this workstation, because this is our JRR AD joined machine. So all of this happens up in the migration agent tab. So we're going to jump over there. We're going to create our certificate first. This is just a certificate used to authenticate communication between the server and the agent endpoint. And you just click create and then save it. The pre-shared key here is a little different than the pre-shared key for the sync agent. It's actually unique to this server and the estate, the entire deployment. So this is the PSK that you're going to deploy out via Intune or your RMM that feeds into our MSI for the agent installer. So this is the same across all machines that are talking to this server to do migrations. I'm actually going to copy this to the clipboard. We'll jump out of our PowerPoint here, and we'll jump over and we'll install our agent. So this machine currently hybrid joined to the JRR domain, as we discussed. So we'll just run our installer. Now, this installer, I'm doing it manually here, but you can, of course, deploy it via any software deployment tool that can run an MSI in the system, may that be Intune, MECM, RMM, PDQ, even group policy in some situations. And we've got a great KB article explaining how to do that. So we'll just kind of go through here, and the first thing we need is our pre-shared key, which came out of the server. And then we need the URL of our server. And we can just talk to this directly on 443, so we don't need the port. But you do have to do the agent. We're going to leave our polling interval to our default of 60, but the polling interval basically just sets how often the PowerSyncPro client migration agent running on the endpoint talks to the server. We're just going to leave it at our default of 60. So with that, we can start the installation. And now the agent's installed. So we jump back over to our PowerSyncPro server, and we go to agents. We can see that Cheetah 38 is now part of this PowerSyncPro server. So during this presentation, we've done a few things. We've fully set up PowerSyncPro server using a marketplace image within Azure. We've gotten that server a Let's Encrypt certificate for the default Azure domain that's provided by Azure. We've set up a remote sync agent on an on-premises server that talks to an on-premises domain controller and shuttles that directory data back across the internet to the server hosted in the cloud. And we've also registered a workstation running PowerSyncPro migration agent to that server. These are all very common tasks that you'll need to handle during a migration deployment, but obviously they're not all encompassing. There's still a few more steps that you would need to handle in a production migration. So with that, my name is Jamie Richard. I'm a technical pre-sales engineer here at PowerSyncPro. If you have any questions about the product, feel free to review our KB, check out the documentation on our website, or open a ticket with our support team. We're happy to help. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.